Hello and welcome to Sensei podcast. This is Manos Brilakis discussing with leaders in the field of CTO and complex PCI. Sensei means teacher or master in Japanese. The goal of the Sensei podcast is to help you learn and improve in CTO and complex PCI so that you can become the best that you can be and offer your patients the best possible results. Hello everyone and welcome to Sensei Podcast. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Jimmy Kerrigan, who is one of the expert CTO operators from East United States from Ascension Saint Thomas Hospital in Nashville. So Jimmy, it's a pleasure to have you today and thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for the opportunity to hang out and chat with you. At the moment, it's the 1st of September. It feels like fall in Nashville and getting to be football weather, which over my shoulder you can tell is a passion of mine when not doing complex intervention.
You know what? I was going to ask about it, but since you bring it up, what does the picture behind you signify?
Family. So, of course, those of us who do complex intervention for a living get used to spending long hours in the hospital. And sometimes we joke that the cath lab staff becomes our family. And some weeks I see them more than I see my family for the benefit of the patients. But also, especially going into, as of today, it's the day before Labor Day weekend, going into a long weekend, making sure to spend time with family when we're able to do so from a standpoint of getting out together, hiking, going to sporting events. As a Vanderbilt fan, some of the sporting events aren't so fulfilling for me, but it's good to spend time with family, remain centered, and make sure that we're making time for ourselves outside of work as much as possible. So that's what that signifies to me when having a long day. I've got a drawer full of thank you letters from patients that I've accrued over the years, and then my family around me, literally and figuratively.
Wonderful. And looks like you are quite passionate for your team, if I can tell from the picture before. So, which I guess translates also into the other areas of life. So you're passionate not just in one area, but multiple areas. And I know you're very passionate for CTO and complex intervention. So maybe you can give us an overview. How did your journey start? How did you decide to do this? And how did you learn? And how did you build your program?
Yeah, absolutely. So going into cardiology fellowship, I guess, relatively undifferentiated. In residency at WashU, I worked under Alan Zaharias as a research mentor, doing research in transcatheter aortic valve replacement, looking at outcomes, racial disparities, et cetera. So when I went to fellowship in Cleveland, I think everybody who's interested in intervention, especially at that period 5, 6, 7 years ago, thought structural is the future, structural is where it's going to be. And nothing against our structural colleagues, of course. Over the course of time, though, and especially during my interventional fellowship, which is a required 2-year fellowship at that institution, and in the second year, everyone is exposed to complex coronary intervention, to peripheral endovascular training, and then also structural training. I found that my interests and passions were a bit further away from TAVR and MitraClip and more with in-stent restenosis management, complex coronary intervention. So a bit of horse trading in my second year, dropping a little bit of structural, picking up some CTO. Sorry, Dr. Kapadia, for doing that. Hopefully I'm not getting in trouble now 5 years later. And then, under the mentorship of people like Steve Ellis and Jay Kotry, became interested in this and developed a basic skill set that I think hopefully has grown and continued over the last 4 or 5 years in practice today. So I had an opportunity after fellowship to come back to the hospital where my father had bypass surgery in 1987, where my family has been treated forever, to come and help develop and expand a complex coronary intervention program. So brought complex intervention here, CTO, retrograde CTO, restarted a brachytherapy program that had been dormant since 2008. It's just been an interesting time to be in Nashville at the hospital that means so much to me and to my family. And I'm proud to be a part of that and look forward to what the next 50 years has in store from that standpoint. But that's been my journey with regards to a bit of training in fellowship, not a dedicated CHIP year, but maybe a CHIP 6 months during that second year of my interventional fellowship. And then getting that basic skill set that I've built upon through mentorship and opportunities to interact with others in the field through clinical research also and industry sponsorships to continue to grow and develop and try to create something that's great.
Perfect. So essentially, you took advantage, and obviously, Cleveland Clinic with we see Steve Ellis and Jay Academy, phenomenal place with a lot of tradition and excellent operators. So took advantage of it and were able to learn your basic skills during the fellowship, which is actually different than most people. I think most people learn on the job and through proctorship essential. How did you how did you learn the basic skills? Was it because being a quote unquote first year or maybe even second year interventional fellow, sometimes you don't always get the opportunities maybe to be on the front and do the more complex PCIs. How did you end up learning the specific skills? Undergrad, retrograde, ADR. Was it part of it through fellowship and afterwards? How did that work?
So again, had the blessing of training under mentors who let us be first at the table. I do know, and I've heard from fellows over the years since graduating, that may not always be the case. So my advice to fellows now is when there's an opportunity to do so. I understand in a 1-year interventional fellowship, it's September, so you may not be at the point where you're primary on a retrograde case yet, but make sure by the time, if that's an interest to you, that you get your hands on the equipment and understand why it's important to disengage your retrograde guide, et cetera. So that when you go into practice and you're doing it independently under the eye of a proctor, you at least have those basic skill sets. So I did have the privilege of training at a place where I was first at the table. I was the one manipulating microcatheters, advancing wires, under close supervision, of course. And not that I had my hand slapped because that would indicate physical violence, but at times I had to step back and let Steve or Jay take over and then show me the next step. And with our fellows today here at St. Thomas, I enjoy pimping them. Sometimes they don't enjoy it, but try to figure out what is the limit of your knowledge base or your skill set, and how do we get you to that next step? And I think that the mentors in Cleveland, and I keep picking on Steve and Jay because they focus on complex intervention, Dr. Kapadia and Krishnaswamy, everybody, has their skill sets, and they help us learn all of this. And did have the benefit of having a 2-year program. And in the first year, complex intervention was Impella multi-vessel PCI, left mains, atherectomy was all taught in the first year, and second year was really for these CTO cases as well. So I think a graduated opportunity, making sure that the mentors that are identified, at least in fellowship, where you actually can have them scrub with you. Proctors can't do that most of the time. You get your hands on the equipment, you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then after training, continuing that education through proctorship, having people like yourself and others come to Nashville, watch cases, give feedback live, which is slightly different because for the fellows who are watching the podcast, the proctor doesn't scrub with you the vast majority of the time. They can't actually touch something. Stefan really wanted to when he's been here, but he wasn't allowed to and didn't touch anything. But you get that experience, which is also quite invaluable because I, as a fellow, learned a way to do CTO PCI from the Cleveland Clinic method. But then when people come in from Emory, from Mid-America, from Minneapolis, from Washington, wherever, then you learn other approaches that help to add to the skill set. But I do think it's incredibly important while in fellowship, if this is a passion of yours, to get the basic skills down with regards to manipulation of microcatheters, how to direct a wire, how to perform Stingray or other technologies for ADR that are coming in the future as well. How to do a retrograde case and what is the importance of managing your guides, et cetera. What are the pitfalls? I often joke that I'm afraid of lawyers and administrators, but I'm also not afraid of complications, but trying to figure out how to prevent that, of course. And knowing that we are in a field where the complication rates in open CTO are higher than standard PCI, and those are expert operators. I don't pretend to be one. There are opportunities there to minimize those risks to yourself and the patient. And that brings up an interesting point with regards to self-minimization of risk from an orthopedic standpoint, radiation exposure standpoint. I joke with my patients, I'm retiring in 27 years. I hope in the next 27 years I don't need back surgery or anything like that. Having seen colleagues go out for months at a time with orthopedic issues. So making sure you're protecting yourself that way is also important. But yeah, I think that in fellowship, getting that exposure, getting my hands on the catheters, on the wires, on the guide extensions, understanding different atherectomy options, when to use what and do so safely was important. And then building on that through proctorship, networking, clinical research, et cetera, to try to expand those skill sets as well.
Wonderful. Now, which was the thing you found the hardest to learn? Was there a technique? Was there a mindset? What was the thing that was the most difficult to master?
Yeah, I think that probably the most difficult thing isn't how to stick and swap, not how to use a retrograde septal or an epicardial. I think the most important thing is appropriateness. So making sure that we're able to case select. Now, I don't want to say that I'm a cherry picker because there aren't cases that I turn down based on anatomy, but maybe based on appropriateness. It's not infrequent, I guess, to have patients referred for CTO intervention of their right coronary because they have a stress test that's abnormal, but they're completely asymptomatic on medical therapy. So having those risk-benefit discussions and not just doing something because you can, but ensuring that the things that we do are because we should. I think that for me has been the biggest thing once in practice, especially as a fellow. Of course we want to do it. We are trying to figure out why are we sending this patient to bypass surgery? Why can't we fix their LAD circuit right coronary? This patient was referred with a CTO to clinic. Why can't we do it even though they're asymptomatic? Understanding the indications, understanding appropriateness, but then also getting yourself mentally to a place where you're not turning away cases because of anatomy. Making sure that if you have a case that's particularly difficult, that's an opportunity to say, hey, Dr. Balakis, could you come to Nashville? I'm going to set up some cases that I think are going to provide technical challenge to me, but making sure those cases are appropriate. That way, if there is an issue, if it's not successful, if there's a complication, God forbid, you can look the patient and their family in the eye, knowing you did the right thing. I think building that sense of appropriateness, making sure that you stick with doing what's best for the patient, not necessarily what's best for your growth and development, your pocketbook, whatever it is. I think that's important to keep in mind. And that's a skill set that's learned over time especially at least in our interventional fellowship, it's about our numbers and how many cases did you do and what's the coolest thing you did so I could show it at cath conference on Friday morning, which is important as well in a limited time span when you only have so long to learn these tools and techniques. But generally speaking, in practice, what should I be doing? How am I going to help the patient? And keeping that as the primary focus has been really important for me to learn and develop over the last several years.
Wonderful. Now, when you do these cases, do you get nervous?
Somewhere over my shoulder is Steve. The cath lab jokes, I have one emotion, and it's disappointment at times with them, and his name is Steve for some reason. I try not to. Of course, there are situations, so if there's a perforation and you notice that you're spilling contrast into the pericardium, then trying to keep the rules of the house of God in mind. Remember, the patient has the disease and you don't run to codes, things like that. So trying to make sure that you remain calm and collected, often because, especially once you're in practice, or for those that are in practice, you're the captain of the ship. People are looking at you to understand what is the next step. And if you're nervous, and you're at least outwardly nervous, then they get nervous. And then when people get nervous, they make mistakes. So I think that it's also important to control the things that we can control, making sure that you run a relatively tight ship with regards to having a neat table, a neat bed, because if you get into a situation where you need something quickly, knowing where that is and not hunting through a pile of empty hoops on the back table is important. But I do. I mean, you get nervous, but I try to minimize my outward expression of that nervousness, which leads to a lot of bottled up anxiety, I guess, which goes deep into someone's core somewhere, and who knows where that goes and how it comes out. Bill Lombardi, as a mentor, now has switched a lot and talks a lot about mental health. I think that's important as well. So after his presentation at CTO Plus 2 years ago, I guess the first one back after COVID, talking about mental health, I set up a standing appointment every 2 weeks with a therapist who works with physicians, and to talk through some of those issues about managing anxiety and when there's a complication, how to manage that so that I don't get behind. It's been quite valuable to do so, to have that standing meeting and just have somebody to talk to, a disinterested third party who's relatively non-judgmental, whose name actually happens to be Steve, completely separate from my emotion. But yeah, there is nervousness, there is anxiety. If you're human, you're going to feel as though there are things that set you off kilter, but then righting the ship as well as possible, especially in the moment where you have to continue working, because the patient isn't going to get any better if you stand there and stare. And if your staff doesn't know what the next step is, if there's a perforation, if there's a dissection, if the patient becomes hemodynamically unstable, then that also adds to the nervousness. So I think ways to obviate that is through drilling yourself, your staff, attending courses like complications, like CTO Plus, TCT, going to the lectures that help you understand what to do in those situations. I think the best solution for anxiety is preparedness, and trying to not only anticipate the next step in this procedure, but then programmatically, what can we do to make sure that if there is a problem, that we're prepared to manage that and try to assuage those anxieties up front.
Wonderful. And as you say, I mean, this is the nature of the area, that you're going to have these cases where it don't go well, or they have complications, or things don't work out. How long do this affect you for a while? If you have a complication, does that spill over for time? Do you get affected? Do you get over it quickly? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I'm sure it depends on the magnitude of the complication. Thinking about, there have been a couple of times that if early in the day there's been an issue with a patient. Thinking back to one case where the IV was disconnected and we were giving heparin for a left main bifurcation intervention. and got started with ballooning and put the wires down, ballooned after the initial bolus of 10,000 of heparin or whatever was given. Get the ACT back, and the ACT was 140. And turns out the IVs disconnected. The heparin went on the bed. And then what turned into a relatively straightforward left main bifurcation became a mechanical thrombectomy, removing the clot, getting new guide, new gear in because the entire thing had clotted off. And thankfully the patient did well and survived and just had a slightly longer length of stay for what would have been an outpatient procedure. But I think that day, because my adrenaline was high, I was on edge. It was an early case. I don't think it was the first of the day, but it was earlier. I canceled the day and said, look, to the rest of my patients who are here for your right and left heart caths, for valve workups, or whatever the case may be, I am not in a position today. This is not the day for me. I don't want to go into a procedure having known that the procedure before yours or two before yours, whatever, may not have been the most successful. So let me find one of my partners who can take on your case, because there are 6 or 7 of us in the lab at any given moment. So they are able to take on some of that volume. Or if they want to reschedule and work with me specifically, then we can do so. So there have been days that I have been affected. But then those are also the days that I take solace in the fact that I have staff who are understanding, partners who care, family, of course, who are there for me as well. And we have a relatively well-developed heart team meeting. We have a relatively well-developed M&M. So bringing these cases forward in a non-judgmental fashion to say, all right, here's what happened. How can I learn from this? How can I move on? And how do we prevent this from happening again in the future? So, from that particular case, I get a bit skittish putting wires down before I wait my 3 minutes and check the ACT and at least see it's over 200, which interventional cardiologists are not known for their patients. But at times, if we can stand there for a couple of minutes, prep the IBIS, whatever we need to do for the case anyway, and then take that time to make sure we prevent complications in the future, which I do think when at least for me, when I get pimped, when I get asked questions by an attending, by a mentor, it makes me a little bit nervous. And I think that bit of anxiety helps me remember the answer. I think in the moments where there's a complication, a perforation, donor vessel thrombus, whatever, that anxiety helps me remember, I don't like the way I felt when I didn't know the answer or there was an issue. So let's make sure that doesn't happen again. So I think that there is a bit of an adaptive response from the standpoint of anxiety makes you remember just a bit. But yeah, it can affect you, and it's okay to walk away and say, look, this is not my day. The last thing you want to do is cascade a bad day into other procedures because you're off your game for whatever reason. And I think patients really appreciate that and understand that. Staff also appreciates that, saying, hey, I was on call last night. Make sure I don't do something stupid today if, you may not be on your game. Thankfully, I wasn't called in last night, so I'm on my game, at least at the moment at, 7:21 in the morning Central Time. But we'll see how the day goes.
Sounds perfect. So Jim, actually, you alluded to this earlier on, but bad things can happen to the patients, but also to the operators. And you brought up about radiation, spine, lead, and everything else. So, how worried are you about this? What do you do about radiation?
Yeah, so I wasn't worried about this in fellowship. This wasn't something where I had the vision forward. But then thinking back to the attendings who I worked with as a trainee and their times away because of orthopedic issues, people passing of cancers and having issues related to radiation exposure, especially people from an era where it wasn't that well known. So I think the easiest thing to do, of course, is wear your lead, use your shielding, raise your table, drop your II for the basic lab hygiene with regards to radiation reduction. But I think that the issue then becomes, the 30, 40 pounds of lead, depending on the vendor, years over years, what is that taking a toll-wise with regards to your body? Of course, personal health and exercise is very important, but I do think that we're at an era relatively underpenetrated at the moment, but potentially on the verge of getting out of lead, whether that looks like individual radiation reduction strategies with things like zero gravity, whether that looks like Rampart, where the entire room is out of lead. Robotic PCI has unfortunately been de-emphasized, I guess, by Siemens now, but hopefully in the future would provide an opportunity as well to be a little bit removed from the table as others may come to market from that standpoint. Protego and other radiation reduction strategies. I think it's important to explore the opportunities that are there, figure out which of those make sense for your workflow. In our lab, at least for the complex interventions, for specific complex interventions, the CTOs and such on Tuesdays, we double scrub that with 2 physicians. So Elias Haddad, one of my partners who's been in practice for some time, and I, double scrub and alternate primary. So it doesn't make sense for us in that situation to use zero gravity, because then we'd have 2 zero gravities at the table and then, fighting with each other and clinking shoulders, I guess. So maybe Rampart or Protego or something like that's a better situation in that situation. Similar for structural heart. For TAVRs, you have dual operator in this country, so making sure everybody's protected. Maybe for a paravalvular leak closure, another longer, more complex case, something like zero gravity would make sense. And then there are other options too that are quite interesting. We're exploring with G-Lift, which is a self-supported lead system, STEMRAD, which is more of like a robotic-supported lead system. There are so many options out there. I think that it's just important to remain conscious of the fact that radiation exposure is cumulative over time, so that with the technology you have available, make sure that you're optimizing your cath lab hygiene to minimize scatter and exposure to you, your staff, and the patient, and then trying to figure out which of these technologies is going to be best for our workflow. And we're in the process of evaluating a few, have evaluated a few, and then hopefully, as the capital cycle allows, be able to bring those into the cath lab beyond the zero gravity that we have.
Perfect. And again, being holistic, I think helps for. I think you mentioned 27 years, so yes, spending a long time. I guess that's. You really want to go there deep into retirement. I think many people are making plans for retirement, but we'll get to this in a second. But tell me about the trainees. So you're training the fellows, and you've done it for a while. And how does that help you, first of all? And number two, how do you select those fellows, and how do you assess them?
Yeah. So second question first. Tamir Paul is our fellowship director, and we have 3 spots per year and had over 900 applicants this year. So about to start on the fellowship interview season. Looking forward to it, and looking for that perfect fit for somebody who's interested in excellent patient care, a clinical program that is very busy, becoming involved in clinical research, which is near and dear to our hearts and becoming very important, is very important to our mission. And making sure that we, as physicians and educators, are keeping the fellows as well at the center of that. So I think that it's an opportunity to make sure that through interviews, through conversations with current fellows, former fellows, graduates of various programs, to those who are applying for fellowships, advanced fellowships, et cetera, making sure that it's a great fit and ensuring that the place that you are going matches what your expectations and hopes are. There are certain fellowships where you're going to work, you're going to be on the inpatient service, you're going to see patients. There's not as much protected time potentially for research. There's not a research year. And if your focus is doing, translational or basic science, that fellowship might not be the best for you. But then other fellowship programs where that's an emphasis. So making sure that your interests, your hopes and dreams and your passions align with the fellowship, not just picking because, I had a friend who went here, or this fellowship has a great name, but making sure that really fits is important. And I think that through the interview process on both sides, the fellows have to rank the places, and thankfully interventional cardiology will be on a rank soon, but making sure that you rank places or choose places based on your interest, and that we, as the evaluators, the interviewers, the faculty, are choosing fellows who are compatible with what we want as well. The last thing we want, any of us want, is for a fellow to come in and be miserable because they either felt as though they weren't given the full story when they started their fellowship journey, or because they misjudged what their personal interests were. So which is why sometimes we ask some probing questions. Of course, all the legal questions, there are some questions we're not allowed to ask, but making sure that we're asking questions to understand what it is that you are looking for so that we can give you guidance. And if we're not the perfect program, we'll figure out who is and try to give you that guidance as well, and continue seeing you at ACC and TCT and meeting up for those conversations. I think having fellows and working at a place with fellows is an incredible opportunity to stay up to date and to be challenged. When you're working with nurses and techs, and I didn't have the opportunity to work with nurses and techs in fellowships, the model was only physicians were at the table, so I didn't know how to interact with people in that setting. So it was kind of an interesting learning curve when I first started in practice. But I do think that if you're not doing something optimally, and you're working with nurses and techs, often they don't feel comfortable saying, hey, why aren't you using IVUS in this situation? Or why did you pick OCT? Or they're not. Sometimes they are. And those are the best ones, and the ones that you want to keep at the core of your complex coronary team, the ones that want to grow and develop, and if you have that opportunity. But I think having the fellows there also holds us accountable to best practices, helps us to grow and develop. Hey, did you see what October showed or Octavia showed at ESC? Oh, I haven't had a chance. I'm 692 articles behind, which is a live look in right now at where my reading list is. But let's talk about it. Let's sit down over lunch and I'll go get you coffee and let's review this and look at the trial design, et cetera. Things that, and potentially even in practice, especially our fellowship is only 3 years old, so I've been here for 5. Before that, it wasn't as much of an opportunity to do so with your peers. To say to Elias, this trial came out, let's go sit and talk about it. It's just not the way that practice usually happens most places. Now, we do have journal clubs and case reviews at our CATH conference, et cetera. But it's just not as direct and informal as it is with fellows. So I think that the fellowship opportunities, if you can practice at a place where fellows are, it's an opportunity to stay up to date, to hold yourself to appropriateness, and to be able to think, how am I going to justify this procedure, this patient care plan, or whatever I omitted, in terms of efficiency for them. So I think it just keeps us young and keeps us up to date and keeps us accountable, which is great.
And then how much the hands-on experience, hands-on skills matter, if they have good hands or not so good hands?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So how to make this de-identify things with regards to HIPAA, fellow HIPAA, I don't know what that's called. Anyway, so there are people who are interested in procedural specialties who may not have the technical skill to do that. So those are the people where you focus educational opportunities and simulator training and say, hey, double scrub this case. You get more if this is something that you're interested in. And as a general fellow, if you get in the cath lab and you say, I want to be an interventional cardiologist, but you're in the cath lab and you find the days boring and you're scrubbing out when it turns to an intervention to go write the report or go to your office or whatever, making sure that during those formative years, it's right for you. Same for interventional fellows. If you are dead set on CHIP as your career, but you get into the cases and, 2 hours into the CTO, you're on the back table squirting saline, writing your name on the drape. Potentially you're not getting enough hands-on experience. So that's an opportunity to ask your mentor, hey, can I try advancing this catheter? Teach me, for a braided catheter, torqueable catheter, teach me how to turn that, et cetera. But if you're not availing yourself of those opportunities, you can't get better. But yeah, I think that there are varying levels of skill. Some people grew up playing video games, others didn't, which may be a big differentiator, actually. Apparently, there was some study that looked at that for video laryngoscopy and intubation people with glide scopes. And if you were a video gamer, you were better at it. But yeah, so the hand-eye coordination is there. It's going to be something that is innate, but over time can be practiced and get better. And the other option, too, or opportunity in practice is to do more. So you don't come out with parallel wiring skills that are world-class. That comes from years and years of experience. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert parallel wirer, but when there's an opportunity to do so, putting a dual lumen catheter down and trying to work through that and trying to challenge yourself to get better as well, to improve those technical skills as a fellow, as an attending, and set those goals. Again, if you're not good at retrograde, or if you don't feel comfortable with retrograde, maybe you have a relatively short segment occlusion, but you've got some great septal collaterals from the LAD. Even if you would normally say, let's start antegrade wire, maybe get a retrograde system up and use that opportunity to get yourself experience and to become better. It's an interesting conversation recently. I think it was at complications or afterwards with regards to, well, doesn't that put the patient at increased risk? But doesn't having a fellow potentially put patients at increased risk as well? So we're at a training institution. A lot of us work at places where we have fellows that we are responsible for training. The patients come to us knowing that fellows are involved in their care and they're willing to take that risk. So is there an opportunity there to say the same thing, that even though antegrade wire is going to be successful 85% of the time, potentially a retrograde first opportunity, so that when it's my only chance or only option, I'm more comfortable with it, would be beneficial to your skill set and then to the patient population overall, which I think is an interesting tack to take. Sometimes hard in the moment to do, but I think probably is the right thing to do. So if your hands aren't where you want them to be, practice until they are. Tiger Woods didn't pick up a golf club. I guess he did at 3 years old and started hitting it like he does. But generally speaking, we're not all Bill Lombardi from the start. And I don't know that Bill was Bill when he started. These are skill sets that, of course, were developed and learned over time as well. And we have the opportunity, again, through a great network of mentors, through proctors, through industry sponsorships with simulators, et cetera, to get that hands-on experience, both in patients and in models, to just get better every day is the goal.
So what's the one thing that excites you the most? So you see someone who wants to be in the program and get trained by you. What is the number one thing for you?
I'm apparently the research person on interview day. I'm the one that's asking them about their research interests, what they've done in the past, what their passions are in the future, as someone who really does enjoy partnership, clinical research, et cetera. I am the one on interview day that is going through that, looking at those opportunities and trying to ensure that their research passions align with ours. If their background is in gene expression in zebrafish with cardiac development, we're not going to be able to offer you that opportunity. We don't have an animal lab. But we'll make sure to recommend to you that there's a great place for you down the street at Vanderbilt or wherever that would be. I do think that when I see somebody who's interested, that's really it. Sometimes, it's actually interesting, especially since we've gone to virtual interviews. Advice for fellows who are going through the process now and interviewing virtually, what you do in the waiting room actually also matters. So having sat in these meetings at the end of the day where we're going through the list of candidates, the program coordinator who is interacting with the fellows in between their virtual meeting sessions and doing the introduction to the program, introduction to Nashville, whatever, will often bring up, oh, so-and-so was on their phone the entire time, or their camera was off and they were looking away, or whatever. So I think that also becomes important. So the passion that you express for a program from the interview standpoint is not only in the interviews, it's also in between the interviews, interacting with the program staff, interacting with the other applicants. Interestingly, that has been taken into account in certain situations with regards to where we place a person on a rank list as to their overall interest. So what excites me is excitement from the fellow and the applicant to make sure that they're interested in us, and this isn't just a check on a box, because I guess it's now really easy to just check a bunch of boxes and apply a bunch of places. But we, excitement, and then passion for clinical research, which is again one of my areas of interest, and what apparently I've been discovered to be the person who cares the most about in fellowship interviews.
Perfect. So the lesson, I guess, the message for people applying to every program actually is, don't turn your camera off during the time off and show excitement, even when you're in between interviews, which makes
just
perfect
talk to
sense.
the other applicants, talk to the program coordinator, pay attention, look at the camera. Don't look down at your cell phone and etc. Put it on silent, which has failed me a couple of times already, even though it's been on silent the entire time. So I apologize.
Yeah, no. So Zoom etiquette, I mean, it's important for many things in life.
Yeah.
So Jimmy, you have a very busy practice. You're training fellows, a lot of things, a lot of demands on your time and energy. How do you keep in good shape to do all this?
Yeah, so that is a challenge, right? So when you're getting to work at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we have a private service, so I round on my patients, and then starting procedures, first stick at 7, sometimes getting done at 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. More often than not, it's like 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But making sure to take time for yourself. I think we started the conversation with this as well. So what you're doing in the hospital is incredibly important. In training, in practice, the patients are your primary focus, and it's really hard to turn that off at times. And something I struggle with as well. Joe from House of God coming in on their day off to look in on patients. I get made fun of because maybe at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, I'm logging into the EMR to see, hey, what did they decide to do with my patient who's here this weekend? And then sending the nurse practitioners or fellows maybe some gentle suggestions on things that I would do. I struggle with this is stepping away when I'm away, not being a micromanager from the standpoint of, this is not my responsibility. But again, finding those opportunities for vocations that are personally fulfilling, not professionally fulfilling naturally, but personally fulfilling. So spending time fishing with the kids, going on hikes, attending sporting events, travel, cooking, whatever it is that is a passion for you with regards to that. I'm not going to give you a great lecture on work-life balance because 5 years into practice, I haven't figured that out yet. And wanting to make sure that, when I'm at work, I, of course, have a focus on my patients. When I'm at home, trying to have a focus as much as possible on family. Making moments count is something that I think is really important and hard to do, but, trying to work on that with my wife and my children so that when we have those moments together, we know that they're relatively limited versus other professions where you go to work at 9 and come home at 4:30. Trying to make sure that we maximize those opportunities together, and then sometimes that does lead to, all right, we've got the kids to bed, my wife's gone to bed, all right, time to go work on this paper or research or whatever. The work-life balance aspect of it is important to try to figure out how to maintain, but making sure that the time you have with your loved ones outside of work is maximized has been my mental health relief from that standpoint. It's something that we all could get better on and need to work on, but over time and with practice, it's interesting. So my wife's a physician as well. She's a stroke neurologist. And I remember early on in practice, a comment was made. Oh, I thought your hours were supposed to get better after you got out of the fellowship, not worse. It's like, well, the rock continues rolling uphill. Rock's not the word I would normally use, but it's a podcast internationally, so I won't use the word I was thinking. The responsibilities continue to grow, and Manos, of course, you know this as well, that you're accountable for yourself, your time, your patience. So just trying to figure out in practice what you want that to look like, how to balance that time in and out of the hospital, especially in situations where you can't really set your schedule. You're in clinic this day, you're in procedures this day, you're in complex coronary, and have to get the work done and have to keep and do a good job, not rushing to get home for whatever. So again, making those opportunities outside of the hospital count, making sure that you're paying attention to personal health opportunities, again, back to radiation protection. How are you going to have a long, successful life, not necessarily just a long, successful career?
Absolutely. So, Jamie, do you have any favorite books or any favorite movies?
So a kid of the 80s and 90s. So actually one of my favorite movies is Mulan. I get made fun of for that from a Disney standpoint. For some reason, it resonated with me as a kid. Red Dawn as a kid and Shawshank Redemption. Those are all very, very trite and popular media. I'm not so deep as to pick some esoteric movie that people haven't heard of, because I honestly don't have a ton of time for TV and movies. In college, I was an English literature major. My senior thesis was on Ulysses and biblical allegory, because I knew that was going to be one of my last chances to read. Favorite books historically, Dostoevsky and Russian literature as well has been quite interesting with regards to the way that multiple pathways to tell the same story are explored. Most recently, unfortunately, my 10-year-old daughter called me a Dementor, and I had never read the Harry Potter series, so I read all the Harry Potter books, and that was great. So spent her 10th birthday at Harry Potter World, which was quite exciting for her. And then she was grounded after I found out what a Dementor was, because I don't think I suck her soul that often. But yeah, I think that, by and large, a lot of my time spent with leisure activities with reading and watching tends to be related to athletics, Vanderbilt sports in particular, which is also a source of depression, I guess. But I'll work with my therapist on that on Monday.
Well, I'm glad you have the plans to decompress and get through that. So it's fascinating about Ulysses. So do you think that affected your choice of career and plans? Wandering around, going through challenges, trying to make it home to Ithaca, or how did that affect you as a person?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. With regards to overall effect, I think that critical thinking is incredibly important. All too often, we're taught what to think, not how to think. And being at Vanderbilt for undergraduate training, a big focus was on how to think. So I think that, and the ability to merge, two completely different genres into one with, the Bible and Ulysses was an opportunity to try to create connections where potentially they weren't immediately apparent and obvious. Which with retrograde PCI, sometimes those connections aren't immediately obvious, but we have to try to find our way through the septum or whatever. I'm not thinking about my senior thesis when I'm in the middle of a retrograde PCI, but no, I think that the opportunity to take and to learn and to think critically, but then also think in a way that isn't as directly scientifically related, is quite interesting. And I do think that training and background has given me an interest in medical writing with regards to, sometimes, and I often get in trouble because my papers are too flowery and too many adjectives are used, but that's just me as a writer, because coming from an English major background. Jen Tremmel also has a English background, so when I get her edits back, I often feel a bit bad about mine, because hers are so much more in depth. But yeah, I think that just the critical thinking aspect of things, the journey also is never where we're going to predict it. Had you asked me when I was 6 years old what I was going to be doing, it was going to be open cardiac surgery at this hospital. So I got that part right of it at least. But over the course of my training, came to realize that my passions were in the minimally invasive, the endovascular, the PCI route, as opposed to cutting people open. So also keeping in mind that the journey may not end where you expect it to, and ensuring that we are keeping all of those options open so that we can grow and develop and never closing doors on ourselves.
And just curious, what were the connections between Ulysses and the Bible? What were the key ones?
Yeah, so going back and looking at various time points throughout, and I haven't thought about this in 20 years. So various time points in the story where you could go back and find similar biblical stories So looking at parallels between the journey and what there is in both the Torah and the New Testament from a standpoint of personal discovery, and very similar to Moses wandering the desert for 40 years with regards to you don't know the end of the tale. There are going to be challenges placed in front of you that you don't anticipate, and then the ability to be flexible to counter those, to grow, to develop, and to succeed are important. Whether that in life is everything that we do. I guess you don't know at the beginning of the day. It's 7:45. I don't know what at 7:45 tonight what's going to happen in the next 12 hours. I hope that it's good, but I need to be prepared for anything that comes my way. So again, having that open-minded sense, making sure that the decisions we make don't limit ourselves in any way, so that we can continue to grow and develop personally, professionally, and the patients that are taken care of.
Perfect. What are you most proud of, both personally and professionally?
I mean, my family, my kids are great. My daughter's 10, she's in 5th grade. My son is 6 and just started kindergarten, which is kind of weird in Tennessee. Like, people hold boys back, and so they're the oldest in the class. I'm incredibly proud of them. They're great people. They are intelligent. I hope they don't hear this until they're like older and stuff, because I want them to not know they're intelligent. I want you to work really hard, guys. Keep reading and keep doing your math and practicing. But they're good people. They're kind. And I think that that's something that I can be proud of, and probably 90% that's my wife's doing, because she's a kind person and intelligent and hardworking and beautiful. But I'm just proud of, personally, the family that I have. Backstory, you don't have time for my backstory, but come from a family that's not, nuclear and whole. And so to have something where we can hopefully provide that opportunity for my children. Again, trying to make sure that when we're out of the hospital, that they remain a focus as much as I possibly can. Again, keeping in balance the lectures that I need to write and the papers that I need to review, etc. Professionally, it's coming back to a hospital that has been so important to my family in Tennessee, and helping to grow a program that I want to be the best in the region, and then eventually the best in the country. Making sure that we have the opportunities to do that through clinical research, through having the appropriate equipment. I remember when I first got here, it was Fine Cross and Pro Water, and we've come a long way since then. Nothing against Pro Water and Fine Cross, but for epicardial collateral crossing, maybe Pat Whitlow could have done it and Steve Ellis, but not me. So developing a program, helping to develop a program, it wasn't all me, where we want to be premier in the region. We want to provide the best care for patients. We want to provide clinical research opportunities to advance the care for patients, not only locally, but nationally and internationally, and then provide education for fellows to grow the next generation of leaders. So I think my small part in helping to achieve that at our institution is my biggest source of professional pride, taking a program from where it was August 1st of 2019 to where it is September 1st of 23, to try to say that we've done better and we've improved patient care, we've improved patient lives, and improved the lives of fellows. And every day that we are here, the struggle and hope is that we can continue to do that, to grow, to develop, to get better, identify those coaches and mentors, and be the coaches and mentors for others who need it. So that's what I'm most proud of professionally. But in that order, personal over professional. I hope I can keep that order in mind most of the time.
Perfect. Well, again, very busy, a lot of exciting things ahead. How many hours do you sleep?
What's sleep? I'm not familiar with that term. That depends on the night. So I was on call last night. So I tried to go to bed early last night, lest I get called at 2:00 in the morning and lose a few hours there. But yeah, generally in bed by 10:30, up at around 5:30. So depending on the night and what else is going on. The kids are in bed by 8. My wife is sleepier than I am, so usually she's asleep by 9, and then sometimes I'll get up and, as we talked about, go finish a couple of slides or work on reviewing this paper or catching up on reading, which 694 articles now. I've lost one since our conversation started. So just trying to keep all that balance. But thankfully, I've been blessed with a love of caffeine and a need to not sleep as much as others. But it's interesting. Yeah, it depends on the night.
And what are the things in research, which obviously is a big part for your life and the people, what is the thing that excites you the most at this point?
And this is completely irrelevant to this podcast and this topic, but I think pulmonary embolism management is very interesting. At the end of OPCI back in June, there was just a small segment on the management of pulmonary embolism. And it reminds me of potentially where cardiology was at the TIMI 1 era, or where stroke neurology kind of is now. Again, my wife and I have these conversations. We know there's a clot. Do we need to do anything? If we need to do anything, do we give lytics? Do we do catheter-directed thrombolysis? Do we do mechanical thrombectomy? So a lot of our research is in partnership with trying to figure that out for CDT versus mechanical thrombectomy. Do we do mechanical thrombectomy versus heparin or CDT versus heparin? Trying to figure out in this field, the question is, do we need to do anything at all? And if we do it, how do we do it the best? So I think it's quite interesting from that standpoint. I also think that there is another passion of mine, of course, imaging and physiology. So things like defined GPS, does post-procedural physiology matter? We think from defined PCI that it probably does, but proving it in a randomized fashion that maybe we should be targeting a post-procedural non-hyperemic index of 9.5 or greater. So that's also quite interesting from an imaging and physiology standpoint. At the end of the day, the goal of research is to improve patient care, making sure that we're doing what we can the best way possible and optimizing those outcomes. And without participating in the research, it's hard to know what the next steps are going to be. But making sure that we have that option for patients and can explain to them, we're participating in this study or that research trial. Do you want to come with us on this journey? And more often than not, they do, because they're interested in the same questions and wanting to make sure that we're potentially optimizing their care for their family members in the future, even if it can't be for their particular procedure or their condition or whatever, whether it's drugs, markers, whatever. I think PE, imaging and physiology, will continue to grow and develop from the things that I work on professionally.
Wonderful. And do you show cases to your wife, as a physician, or does she show cases to you, or not?
Absolutely. So I have been told that HIPAA protections do not extend to your spouse because they can't testify against you in court. And technically, she's on staff here because she does some telestroke for some of our regional hospitals. We both discovered that we hate clots and LDL. So we have competitions. Our bedtime pillow talk is what was the lowest LDL you saw today. And then a lot of sharing clots from mechanical thrombectomy, from PEs, from STEMIs, and then she shows me the clots that come out of her patient's MCAs, which look so dainty and small in comparison. But that's fine. I'm not going to tell her that until she hears it on this podcast. We show cases, we share cases. And there are times that we lean on one another for each other's expertise, which is why I think a lot of times at conferences as well, there is a great opportunity for multidisciplinary interaction. Some of the best conferences I've been to have been cases where maybe there's coronary thrombus and it's resistant to removal. And having vascular surgery, IR, interventional neurology, interventional cardiology on a panel to discuss these cases, they're talking about techniques that I'm not as familiar with. So I think that having another physician look at a case, not necessarily your spouse or somebody from a different specialty, but when you get into a situation in the lab where things aren't going the way that you want them to, pausing and asking somebody else to come in and take a look. Hey, here's where we are. Here's what I've done. What should I do next in the acute setting? And then also in the review process. So having a well-developed heart team meeting, a cath conference, an M&M to review these opportunities to help with personal and programmatic growth and development, I think are very important as well. But sometimes I'll call her and say, hey, what is this thing on this MRI that I'm looking at? I've got a patient who needs complex coronary intervention, but then they have this thing in their head CT. Is it safe for me to put them on heparin, et cetera? Sometimes I get a little bit of a quicker answer from her than our consultants at times. And then the consultants confirm what she says, but at least it gives me a sense of that. There's always an opportunity to lean on others within your specialty, outside of your specialty. And then for the people who are in training right now, making sure you maintain those relationships with your co-fellows as you move out into the world in a de-identified fashion. We share cases among the fellows that were with me and a year above me and then a year below me to say, hey, what would y'all do in this situation? Here's this tough endovascular case that I had for peripheral limb ischemia, and how would you manage it? And then taking, I don't do peripheral anymore unless I'm forced to twice a year or something with an ALI. But how do you take the CTO skills from the coronary and apply that to the peripheral space, or vice versa? So there are opportunities there to continue collaborating and interacting.
Wonderful. So Jim, again, you've done a phenomenal work with everything else and your career and the teaching. If you had to kind of distill the advice you have for the upcoming fellows or early career people who are trying to get into this area, what would your recommendations, your top advice be?
If you're in training, make sure you're the one at the head of the table as much as possible. If you're not at the head of the table, understand why. Is it because you're not good enough? And if that's the case, work with simulators, work with industry, work with your attendings to get better. Or is it because your attending is not secure enough to let you handle that? And I don't know the answer to how to solve that because that wasn't part of a problem for me. So honestly, if you have suggestions for them, please feel free from that standpoint. And then once you're out, Or for those who are already in practice, who are out of their fellowship training opportunities, leverage those proctorships. Go to courses, go to CTO Plus, go to Complications, go to TCT, Arch, Epic, Sky, everything. There are always opportunities for training, for information, for networking. Identify a network of mentors outside of your institution, because a lot of the times if you're wanting to learn a skill set like complex coronary intervention, CTO PCI, ISR management, brachytherapy, whatever you want to start, you're starting it because nobody else is doing it. So figuring out how to identify those mentors. And then early on, honestly, it's easiest to go through industry. Work with your industry partners to say, hey, I'm going to put together 3 or 4 cases. Can you identify a proctor who can come in and help me review the cases the night before, stay there, help me watch the cases, give tips and tricks, and then help me figure out when there are technical failures, why that happens, and how to prevent that in the future. So in fellowship, lean on your mentors and your attendings. In practice, lean on mentors that you develop through conference attendance, through potential clinical research and participation in things like Progress, which has been great for us. And then leaning on our industry partners to make sure those educational opportunities are known and that you take advantage of them when you're able to do so.
Wonderful. Well, once again, thank you so much. Phenomenal work. I think there's so much distilled wisdom in your words. We'll have to go back and hear to this again a few times. But thank you so much again, Jimmy. That was wonderful. Super excited to keep on working with you.
Thank you, Manas, for the opportunity to hang out and chat. I look forward to seeing you in person again soon, San Francisco or sooner. But enjoy the day and happy fall.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Sensei podcast.